Welcome everyone to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, August 6th, 2020. August 6th already. Gosh. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. This was at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th, 2001. Before we go further, though, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. And just to let you know, I'm here for any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You can submit them in the questions and information box online at ae911truth.org. Just go under continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see it. I'll also be monitoring the YouTube stream and the Facebook stream of this webinar to see if there's any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard is covering here. And we'll get to those at the end of the broadcast, as I said. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thanks, Andy. Just so people know something about my background, I was responsible here in the San Francisco Bay Area at a local firm for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this mixed-use $400 million project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and fireproofed parking structure. Altogether, though, about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's jump into it. We have World Trade Center Building 7, the third tower here. Most people don't even know about it. We do conferences all around the country, and overwhelmingly, most architects and engineers don't even know that there was a third skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11. And this is like the third worst structural failure in modern history after the Twin Towers, of course. So did you know about it? Let Andy know, by the way. Andy's going to let you know how you can ask your questions if you didn't catch him the first round there. But here's a 47-story skyscraper, 610 feet tall, easily the tallest building in most of our states. It was part of the World Trade Center complex, just outside the super block known as the World Trade Center. And we have, it's about a football field in length away from the North Tower. And here it is standing just fine before 9/11. And after the morning of 9/11, when the towers collapsed, it's still standing. It had some minor damage, as acknowledged by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. And they acknowledged that this damage was not a significant factor at all in the collapse of this building. And you'll see why in a moment. But first, I want to show you perhaps your first view of this building's collapse. As you can see, the east penthouse collapses first, and 6 seconds later, the entire building drops straight down. So this is what we're going to be looking at very carefully. We're going to break it down for you. But first, what was the official story of this building's collapse?
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, so fires caused this building to collapse. Let's look at those fires. Here we have what we see as the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. As you can see, they're few, they're small, relatively small, and they're scattered throughout the building, presumably caused by the beams that were expelled outward from the Twin Towers. We'll get to that, of course, next week in this three-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Here they are, these fires on the 11th and 12th floor at about 2:30 in the afternoon. And those fires begin to move by 3 p.m. Over to the east side of the building. That's important because NIST focuses their investigation on the east penthouse because, as you saw, it did collapse first. And so their focus is on column 79. The damage to the building was on the other side of the building, which is why NIST has divorced the damage from the North Tower debris from the cause of the collapse as they describe it, centered around the fires, around column 79. In fact, they have a series of fire simulations, which they acknowledge or claim to be accurate. And as you can see, they show the fire developing on the south side, coming around by 3 and 4 and 5 p.m., hovering around column 79 for a few hours there. So a couple of hours at least. And this is a huge problem for many reasons, one of which is their own admission that fires didn't persist in any one location for more than 20 or 30 minutes. So we can see that's true by the actual photographs, which show by 3:50 p.m., more than an hour before the collapse of this building at 5:20 p.m., the fires were gone in this area around column 79 on the 12th and 13th floor, the floors associated with NIST's collapse initiation theory. So more consistent with the progression of the fire as seen in the photographs, AE 9/11 Truth has performed our own fire simulation, which shows these fires reaching column 79 around 4 p.m., but then moving, excuse me, I'm over here, reaching column 79 around 3 p.m., but then moving on, as consistent with the photographs, beyond column 79, leaving it alone to cool for an hour and a half or so. So that's a distinct difference which needs to be addressed by NIST in their response to the request for correction, which we have submitted to them, and which response is due this month in August. But let's go further into NIST's fire theory here.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
So there we have it in a nutshell there, but let's go on. It gets deeper.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
So let's break this down. NIST is saying that the fire was in this area during the hour and a half prior to the building's collapse, which we saw that it wasn't, but let's say it was. It was heating up these long span beams. They're 50 feet long, which they couldn't have done because these beams are fireproofed, as you can see halfway fireproofed during the partial construction photo of the fireproofing here. But let's say that the fireproofing wasn't there, and those beams could have expanded if that fire was there. Then these beams would have, according to NIST, pushed this girder off of its seat on this column 79. So as you can see, that seat is right there. And this girder, though, could not have been pushed off of its seat because that girder had what? Tying itself to the concrete slab up above, 30 shear studs. So it couldn't have slid sideways if it's tied impenetrably, if you will, by the shear studs. But let's say that they weren't there as NIST claims, even though the shop drawings show that they were. This girder slides off of its seat, and it only had to slide halfway off of its seat, according to NIST, because at that point, the flange, the bottom horizontal member of this wide flange beam, folds, and then that allows it to fall off of the seat. And in this theory, NIST doesn't have to have that girder moving more than 6 inches or so off of its seat. Well, it couldn't have done that either, because also omitted by NIST is the stiffeners, these thick 3/4 inch welded stiffeners, which would have provided incredible support to the flange of this column, as you see here in elevation and in plan view here. So NIST conveniently omits those, saying that then the girder only had to fall, be pushed halfway off of its seat before it could fall. But of course, it would have had to have been pushed all 12 inches off of its seat. But let's say that wasn't the case, and NIST is correct. Well, if this girder fell off of its seat, it would have been, the floor above wouldn't have fallen on the floor below, because there's 2 other massive girders framing that floor onto this column also. They would have held it up. So that couldn't have happened. But let's say that it did happen, and this floor 13 fell on 12. Well, calculations show us that there's 10 times less force available dynamically for this floor to have fallen onto the floor below than was required to break those connections below. So we needed 632,000 pounds of dynamic force, but we only have 60,000 pounds of dynamic force. That's a huge problem for NIST, which is conveniently ignored by them. But let's go on and look at the computer animation, which NIST claims proves the theory of their collapse.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
Now watch carefully. We have 400 structural steel connections failing every second along that column 79 vertical corridor, if you will. And then it just stops. Well, wait a minute. That doesn't match quite well with the event. If there was a collapse vertically through the building like this, because of the beams being horizontal beams being tied to the exterior structural steel frame very, very carefully. Oh, we lost our green screen. Oh, that's always fun. Hold on a second. I'm going to just fix that problem for myself. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to roll up the green screen. You get to see what's happening behind the scenes here, folks. There we go. We've got our alternate background. And let's proceed. So we would have had massive deformation of the exterior structural steel perimeter system and the breaking up of granite panels all across the facade on 3 sides, and massive breaking up of windows. But we didn't see any of that in the actual collapse, did we? Well, let's take a look. We have an actual comparison of the video of this building's collapse with NIST's model. Let's see how they compare up and see if there's see if it matches quite well, as Shyam Sunder from NIST says. The East Penthouse falls first. Okay, there's a bit of a match, but then look on the left side, no breaking up of windows other than a dozen of them. And then no massive exterior structural steel frame deformation, as you actually see on the model. So they don't match at all. And they stop their model just after a couple of seconds here. It's a huge problem because the 2 seconds into the overall collapse, it begins to tip over, which is what it would do. It's what we would expect the building to do if there's a failure of structural steel down low in the building that's going to cause a collapse. You'd expect that, but that's not what we see in the video at all. So we submitted a Freedom of Information request to NIST, FOIA, which you can do with agencies to get information. Unless it's a national defense issue, they have to release it. Or unless it might jeopardize public safety, which is what they claimed, why they couldn't release this information to the architects and engineers who design these buildings, who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. We've got to have this information. After all, if this building came down due to normal office fires, then there are hundreds of similarly designed buildings around the world that are also subject to collapsing at near free fall acceleration due to normal office fires. So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. What is that? We've had this in the West for 100 years or so. It's used to winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. We have a question. How did the tower come down? We do background research, make observations. How have other towers come down? We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the tower came down. Maybe it came down by fire, maybe controlled demolition. There's lots of evidence, as you'll see today. We lay out all of the hypotheses that stand a chance here against the evidence, the background research, etc. We don't favor one or another due to our financial or political obligations, which might sway our objective opinion in the matter of whether, in this case, something is a collapse is a controlled demolition or not. We test the hypotheses with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing here. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We try again. We construct a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence until we have one that's fully supported. That's what we're about today, by the way. And let's start with some background research. What are the forces that destroy buildings? That's a reasonable question and probe. Fire is certainly one of them. It's an organic, chaotic process which moves through the building in 20 minutes or so. And looking, so the fire moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. And as NIST even acknowledges, the fires don't persist in any one area for more than 20 or 30 minutes in a modern office building. In fact, modern office buildings, it's one of the reasons they don't collapse. There's just not a lot of fuel there to burn. But say in wood frame buildings, it would fall over to the path of least resistance and not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure that's there in a modern office building, for instance, holding it up. But let's take a look and see what we might expect in a steel frame building that's set on fire on purpose, the largest test of its kind in the UK in 1995. We have For instance, well, in this case, 2,000-degree fires they're trying to achieve with massive fuel loads to, worst possible case imaginable here. Let's see what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, Jonathan Barnett, who joined the FEMA team, is referring here to 9/11, when we lost not 2, but 3 protected steel structures due to fire for the first time ever in history. So this is an incredibly unprecedented event that should have received the greatest attention ever from fire protection engineers, structural engineers, forensic engineers, but it did not. All of the weight was given over to NIST, which investigation was controlled by one man, Shyam Sunder, whom we had the opportunity to meet earlier. What was the conclusion of this test? This is an inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. So even without some of those, many of those beams were not fireproofed, as you see here. They did not fail. They warp. The connections don't fail. So you can't have 400 structural steel connections failing every second, as you saw in the NIST computer model. It's complete fraud. Now, there have been a number of buildings, skyscrapers, that have been on fire. Let's take a look at them.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
Nor did these fires, which occurred after 9/11 in skyscrapers. Massive, fully engulfed fires did not bring one of these skyscrapers down. Some tall buildings have collapsed due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. But we recognize the building as a building after it hits the ground. It's certainly badly damaged, but in this case, concrete columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, as we see in Building 7. And so how about buildings that have exploded, like these ones? We have thick, billowing, enormous, pyroclastic-like clouds expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped plumes. because of the extremely hot gases from the chemical reactions in the explosives. We have witnesses that hear the sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Now, explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down tall buildings, as you see in this series of controlled demolitions. There's only a handful of companies that have the skill to, in the United States, to bring down buildings in the manner that they want by carefully placing shaped cutter charges along the columns and beams throughout the building, hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of them, so they can facilitate the building's destruction as needed. Now, there are a set of features associated with controlled demolition. Let's look at them. There's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure. And there's a straight down symmetrical collapse, usually, if that's what they want, into the building's own footprint, which is usually what they want. There is because that occurs because there's a patterned removal of column supports. And that results in a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. We'll explain these in a moment. There's a total dismemberment of the structural steel system. That's the goal, right? You break it up so that you don't have to break it up manually later. Let the explosives do the work. So there's limited damage to adjacent structures usually. That's one of the goals, right? Patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. The concrete floors are broken up so you don't have to go back later and jackhammer those floors with all odd angles. Very dangerous work that would be. And explosive charges are visible at many of the floors. So these are called squibs in the explosive demolition industry. And there's chemical evidence left behind, of course. This is explosive devices. So if you have these 10 features, you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Now, none of these features are created by fires, especially normal office fires, right? Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. So let alone all 10 of them. So if we have all 10, we can be darn sure that we're talking about a controlled demolition. If we have government documentation, that can be very helpful. Foreknowledge, you don't just bring a building down to the ground in a day. It takes months with experts setting up these explosives, of course. And typically you need approvals from government to do this kind of thing. And the experts agree that's a controlled demolition. Well, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion as to whether something is a controlled demolition. Along with video documentation, of course, this is proof of controlled demolition. Proof in a model which we're going to now apply to Building 7, beginning with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen first to Dan Rather and watch this view that he's narrating here on the afternoon of 9/11.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? Dan didn't use these words after 9/11. In fact, we've not seen on television these clips except for 2 occasions maybe on mainstream television. It's as if it's been wiped under the rug of 9/11. And yet these are this should have been the most studied building failure. Remember, this building was not hit by an airplane. Should have been the number one studied failure. But kids are not, students in architecture schools and engineering schools are not taught about Building 7. They don't know about it. In fact, we have not received one bulletin. The 90,000 members of the American Institute of Architects, not one bulletin from the AIA about this building, even though it's ostensibly brought, according to the official story, brought down by normal office fires. Well, office fires is what we as architects are tasked with making sure never happens, eliminating the possibility with our specification of the fireproofing that goes on these buildings. Feature number 2, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Oh, let's see. Here's from West Street. The east penthouse has already come down. Note that before the overall collapse, a half a second before, the entire west penthouse and screen wall, which are centered over the core columns, drop. They drop a half a second early. This completely wipes out NIST's theory that this failure started on the east side, the left side here, and traveled in about 10 seconds across the width of this building. No, all the core columns had to have been taken out virtually at once to facilitate this symmetrical collapse of this remaining screen wall and penthouse. And yes, it falls into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the perimeter of the building property. Maybe we're not quite convinced yet. Let's put them side by side. On the left, Building 7. On the right, a series of known controlled demolitions. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper, ever? Should it not have been the first hypothesis, if not the only rational hypothesis to be considered by NIST? But no, it came out only years later, in 2011, in a series of very frequently asked questions. And they simply write it off. NIST concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur and found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. The smallest blast capable of failing the building's critical column would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels. Well, we'll look at a technology today that doesn't present that audio signature of that magnitude. But we're being asked to believe that these random fires brought down the skyscraper symmetrically. How about the patterned removal of column supports? How do you get a building to fall symmetrically? You have to remove all the columns virtually at once, any deviation in that pattern, and the building will begin to tip over, as NIST's did, even though they had 7 years to perfect that computer model before they released it. Does fire have this level of precision to remove all those columns? These fires. Think about it. How fast is the building coming down? Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Zero resistance? Let's listen to some structural engineers about the resistance in this building.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
And in fact, the literature shows us that there's a phase where the column provides immense resistance, but then even after failing, it continues to provide up to 25% of that capability, that resistance, even during the buckling of the column itself and afterward. So that is completely ignored by NIST when they finally acknowledge, after being publicly confronted in their press conference, that this is easily measurable, this free fall. They were denying it up to then. They said before that, well, if there was a free fall, that would mean there'd be no structure underneath. Well, duh. Right. Where did it go? When they finally were forced in their final report to admit free fall for a third of this building's 7-second fall, what did they say about the structure? Where did it go? They completely ignore it. How about the building itself, the structural steel frame? It's completely dismembered. Now, we had a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame structure that has collapsed into a pile less than 6 stories tall, like a house of cards, as if those welded moments somehow disappeared or were cut. Remember, buildings that collapse due to natural causes, the columns and beams are not severed one from another. How about the adjacent buildings? Is there limited damage? Yeah, there's limited damage to the adjacent buildings. The building falls into its own footprint. How about witnesses of explosions? Let's first go to Shyam Sunder again.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse, nor reported by witnesses.
No, let's go to some of those witnesses. Here's Daryl, a medical student, interviewed that afternoon on 1010 Winds Radio.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then the worst part.
A sound wave of a clap of thunder, shock wave ripping through the building, windows busting out. How about this witness? Kevin McPadden, who along with others was held back, but near 6 blocks away from the building because they were told it was going to collapse and that it had structural damage. But here's his experience as he's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
A big flash? And then the building coming down? How about this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, they were trapped in the building because they went back up into it, and they didn't realize that it had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. Here's their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion, blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
All of this before Building 7 came down, obviously. Explosions in the building, the lobby gone, the stairwells being taken out. Explosions like this heard by these firefighters?
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Wow. NIST says, oh, this is the sound of one floor falling on another. Well, wait a minute. The building didn't come down yet. These explosions are not a part of the official narrative. Not one of them. NIST claims to have interviewed thousands of people and tens of thousands of photographs, but they conveniently missed these ones. But this witness did not miss much. It's the seismic equipment at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in Columbia University, 20 miles north. There were waves produced, according to the official narrative, by the collapse. Well, they occur around the time of the collapse, but take a look. The peak seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds. But the collapse doesn't happen until 10 seconds later. So how in the world can the collapse cause the seismic signal? Well, NIST has an answer for this. The seismic signal, approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of collapse, was likely due to the falling of debris from the interior in the collapse. Well, that's their theory, right? Presumably, the collapse starts on the east side 6 seconds earlier, but we don't see any deformation here. There's no evidence that there's an interior collapse at all, other than immediately under the penthouse. So how can that cause the collapse? Well, Andre Rousseau comes along in 2009 and 2012. He's an applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. What does he find? Well, gosh, the bell-like form of the graph points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin, this expert claims. So we agree with him. If you read that report, it's quite convincing. So what else can we learn about this collapse? Because we have extremely hot clouds. And the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921, the guide for fire and explosion investigations, which is used throughout the country and largely around the world to investigate these kinds of occurrences, which NIST had a hand in developing, so they should have been very aware of it and required to follow it, as all fire departments are around the country. It says, look for large volumes of gas and a large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, these plumes are observed easily, racing away in every direction after the collapse of Building 7 at 35 miles an hour, rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes, indicating an incredible amount of heat released. And where is that heat coming from? Is it coming from these fires? No, 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 no. It's got to be coming from something on the order of magnitude of this. We're going to look for evidence for this heat now as we look deeper into the aftermath of the pile, because NASA air flights have infrared sensitive cameras that were recording the thermal imaging, recording in the area of Building 7 up here, 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface of the pile. Now, 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit is associated with the hottest office fires. But you saw these fires. They're not even hot as office fires typically go. So how can we get hotter temperatures than that on the surface? There's no fire on the surface of this collapse after it collapses. Let's listen to this structural engineer, Abolhassan Astani Azal.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
So he saw the melting of girders, like this piece of steel, which he documents, piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Melted. Steel doesn't melt in office fires. Steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, steel doesn't evaporate in office fires either. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. It takes 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to begin to melt steel. So we're talking temperatures exceeding 3, 4, or 5 times what these particular fires ever got to in temperature. Now, FEMA documents this phenomena in a metallurgical examination in their Appendix C of the Building Performance Assessment Report in May of 2002. What do they find? Never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese like you have here. Silver dollar size holes, they document. This doesn't happen in normal office fires. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, that's molten iron, that's exceeding 3,000 degrees. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times, but it's completely ignored by NIST. They eliminated it from their report. This whole Appendix C metallurgical examination, completely eliminated. And they say, oh, we couldn't test any steel. Well, you saw the testing of the steel. They say again and again and again, no steel was recovered from Building 7. But you saw the piece of steel that was recovered from Building 7. It was in the metallurgical examination that FEMA did before NIST came in and took over the investigation in 2002. And here's John Gross, the gentleman who took over along with Sham Sunder and led the NIST investigation subsequently. Here he is seen on the pile, cutting off the very piece of steel that was used in that metallurgical examination. There's no question that they were aware of it. His shadow is all over the evidence. Now, some claim that the fires were 1,200 degrees, but even buildings and jet fuel can only produce temperatures up to 1,400 degrees. Okay, that's 1,400 degrees, but steel had melted here. We know that. We've got photographs of the steel dripping, melted steel and iron dripping from the material held in the claws of the excavator. And we can tell by the color of that material what its temperature is. That's just the physics of molten iron and steel. And you can see that it's exceeding 2,500 degrees, more than 1,000 degrees beyond what normal office fires can produce. So what caused it to melt? We'll be looking at one possibility here, thermite, which burns at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, could thermite have produced all of that melting? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, then it would explain the incredible temperatures. It produces temperatures of over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It would explain the presence of molten iron, which you're going to see lots of evidence for in just a minute. And it would explain the presence of sulfur, which NIST failed to explain, actually suggesting that, oh, there's sulfur in gypsum board, the wall board. Well, gypsum wallboard's been used for 100 years to protect steel. It's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's designed to protect. So we have a likely suspect. So this is why we use the scientific method as opposed to the method NIST used, whatever you want to call that. Well, the National Fire Protection Guide 921 says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST says, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But a year later, when pressed, they finally admit, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't test for. Others did, though. It wasn't difficult to find. Stephen Jones, nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, was among the scientists looking into this phenomena. He examines the steel at the International Peace Park in Manitoba. And he says, finds, first of all, that there's quite a jagged pattern here. This is not how the cuts that are made by the iron workers at the steel, on the steel at the site, they have very hot oxyacetylene torches. They can cut straight through. They don't produce this kind of, so what could be producing that and this with what look like pieces of aluminum on it. So he does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the slag residue that he's given from the ends of these beams. He finds aluminum and iron, the ingredients of thermite, along with sulfur, manganese. So it's clear to him that this is a signature of thermite. So he looks into the U.S. Geological study, the USGS, U.S. Geological Society, does their own testing of the dust. And they find in this 2005 report billions of previously molten iron microspheres, almost naked to the human eye, some of them up to a 1/16 of an inch. They document them very carefully. They find that there's up to 6% of some of these samples contain these previously molten iron microspheres, estimated by extrapolation to be up to 4 tons of this material altogether. Where did that come from? It's 150 times the amount of iron particles in background dust, which you can have. There's a lot of iron in our dust, but it's not spherical. It's odd-shaped. But the particles found in the dust are spherical, and they are found by R.J. Lee, an independent consulting firm, environmental firm, finding that these were formed during the event, not before by the welders, not after by the iron workers cutting up the steel, but during the event. And this is resulting from the melting of iron or steel. Very interesting. Well, where did the iron come from? We haven't used iron, elemental iron, solid iron, in our steel high rises for 100 years or so. We have a lot of alloys now. So where did the iron come from? This building was only built in the 70s. The 80s, mid 80s for building 7. Larry Silverstein built this building in the mid 80s, and it became part of the World Trade Center complex. There's so many of these previously molten iron microspheres that they're used to distinguish the World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. Well, how do you create that? Well, here's how thermite works in a controlled experiment. Slowing it down halfway, we see thousands of what look like sparks, but they're clearly, as they cool and fall into the pan, molten iron spheres. Well, how do they get to be spherical? Liquids, when aerosolized or under pressure, form themselves into spheres by surface tension. That's just how it works. So could that explain the dropping of these molten iron droplets? Could that explain the toasting of the tops of these cars parked around the World Trade Center? What else? What other rational explanation could explain the toasting of these cars in this very high heat event? Well, you can make thermite cutter charges in your backyard. Civil engineer John Cole did in Florida. And here's the results. And he can cut cleanly through most of those beams, and this one almost. But you can do an even better job with inventions that were patented prior to 9/11, like this thermite-based apparatus. They use thermite and project thermite streams, molten iron streams, and on the order of hundreds of milliseconds through much thicker sections of steel than can be done by more commonly used shaped cutter charge high energy explosives like C4 or RDX. But that would provide an extremely loud bang, very bright flash. Maybe in a deceptive controlled demolition, they might prefer to use something with less of an audio and visual signature. And fortunately for them, there are devices that were patented prior to 9/11 also, whose casings themselves is made of consolidated, consumable thermite. Nothing left but pools of molten iron, which we'll see in next week's series. Lots of evidence for. But let's go to the dust real quick, because we have a team of 8 international scientists studying this dust from the World Trade Center, which is largely concrete powder, which we'll get to next week as well. But for now, these teams analyzed this dust, and they found that it contains these curious red-gray chips. They thought they were paint at first, but they are attracted by a magnet along with those iron spheres, which were studied. And these are about a 1/16 of an inch long, the largest dual-layered red-gray chips. They get real curious and do XEDS again and find what? Aluminum and iron, the ingredients of unignited thermite. Well, that's not supposed to be in the World Trade Center dust. Iron oxide powder, which is basically rust, and aluminum powder. Of course, there's rust on beams here and there, but this is very different, as you'll see, because they get really curious and zoom in 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope and do this scientific study and find iron oxide crystals, rhomboidal-shaped crystals, and aluminum flat platelets that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. These are nanoparticles. And they're set in this matrix, this bed of oxygen, silica, and carbon. So they're set in this organic bed. Organic material is what gives the explosive, concussive force that TNT uses to knock things over. Normally, incendiaries work by means of heat. So something else is going on here. Very, very high-tech material, which, when they put it in a heater at 422 degrees Celsius, about 758 Fahrenheit, it ignites and produces what when it ignites? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust by the USGS, R.J. Lee, Stephen Jones, and many others. So we know how it got there. As if we didn't know. These molten iron microspheres are found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is a set of evidence that has repeatable experimental self-corroboration that can be used in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. Because it probably wasn't produced in a cave in Afghanistan. This is extremely sophisticated material made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. This is all peer-reviewed in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. The red layer is unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. You can read it. It has not been contested. Nobody submitted a peer-reviewed paper contesting the results of this since 2009. More than 10 years. So we've been looking at direct evidence of destruction with explosives in these 10 key characteristic and very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, none of which is evidence of destruction by fire, let alone all of these features. Modern steel reinforced high rises had never collapsed due to an uncontrolled fire. Why? Well, one reason is the heat is conducted away from its source, so the steel never gets to its critical 1200 degree temperature Fahrenheit, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. It just doesn't happen, or rarely. But to keep that from happening, we fireproof these buildings with cementitious fireproofing, the beams and columns. 2-hour and 3-hour long fire protection. So even if those fires were lasting that long, as NIST claimed, they still would not have sagged or extended or expanded thermally. And we try to keep in these tall buildings the tenants from bringing in large amounts of combustibles. We don't build the buildings out of combustibles either. That helps quite a bit. And we put in automatic fire sprinkler systems to keep this from ever becoming a problem. In the case of Building 7, those sprinklers were said to have been compromised by the collapse of the Twin Towers earlier. We haven't been able to research that adequately to verify that. With data from the FEMA and NIST reports, let's look at it. Official investigations into Building 7. In 2002, as we mentioned, FEMA started out, after volunteers started out, they finally got $600,000 of funding for the FEMA report, but their efforts were hampered. They had bureaucratic restrictions, incredible restrictions, keeping the investigators from getting access to the site, access to the blueprints, access to the public. It was incredible. And this is documented in the New York Times. Finally, NIST takes over and gets $20 million worth of funding. Okay, but they started with the conclusion that fires caused the collapse. This was not an open-ended investigation whatsoever. Admitting in 2006, truthfully, Shyam Sunder says, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. I think you still have trouble. Because they completely ignored this report, of course, in Appendix C that we talked about. FEMA says further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue of how the building came down. So how about the evidence? Surely it was preserved in easily the most puzzling structural collapse in modern history. But no, within 2 weeks, the steel was carted at 400 truckloads a day to be put on barges and sent to China for recycling. 99% of the steel. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't, of course, prompting many experts, like this controlled demolition expert, to speak out.
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
And this expert, Hugo Bachmann, chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, the building was with great probability professionally demolished. And one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE911truth.org and citing a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Very conservatively stated And the University of Alaska, Professor Hulsey, chairman of the Department of Civil Engineering, formerly, who launched a 4-year investigation into the cause of this building's collapse and doing very detailed analysis with his team of PhD researchers in a report that has come out and that you can read. No, he says, first of all, no other tall steel frame building had ever failed due to fire. We got to ensure that the public safety, that the failure mechanism for this structure be understood. So his first approach is to examine the response loads, the building's response to fire loads. Second, rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse. And third, identify the type of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. He uses all the same assumptions that NIST uses in their analysis in order to compare apples to apples. So he has 3 methodologies: simulate the local structural response to fire loads for floors 13 and below; 2, examine the NIST collapse initiation hypothesis; 3, simulate numerous failure scenarios and identify what could lead to the total collapse as observed. So he puts the building into AutoCAD and uses other software, very sophisticated software programs like Abacus and SAP 2000, identifying the specific elements that NIST produced in their initiation of collapse theory, and looking at them very carefully, what really would have happened in this scenario, using the assumptions that NIST used, omitting the structural elements that NIST omitted, and seeing if they could still get the building to collapse. And they found with approach 1, that NIST overestimated the exterior wall rigidity, that the exterior walls were very flexible relatively, actually, that the movements would have been bowed out the exterior wall, not pushed the other way, that girder A 2001 moved off its bearing seat, as NIST argued, but they didn't find that. The seat was in the movement of that beam was actually in the opposite direction, and when the shear studs were put on, it didn't move at all, of course. So through Abacus software, they found that NIST's erroneous assumptions that the shear connections in several beams were broken, they found those to be completely unsubstantiated. As well, that the bolts fastening the girder to the column were not broken either. What else did they find? The columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail, as NIST claims. 79, 80, and 81, if they did fail, could they have led to the failure? The building would have tipped over, not gone straight down, as you see here. Whoops, as you see here. Oh, this one. There we go. We got a time lapse. It would have tipped over if those columns were overloaded. That's obvious. They're not in the center of the building. The building would have tipped over. So SAP 2000 in approach 3 finds that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns, but a global failure. And this is what is found by the University of Alaska at Fairbanks in this 4-year, $300,000 study, that they do finally mimic the actual behavior of the building's collapse as seen in the videos. What happens in order for that? Well, the essential in order for that to happen, fire, not fire. It didn't cause the collapse of Building 7. The temperatures were not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel frame. Thermal expansion did not result in the loss of support for the beams and girders. WTC7 did not experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of its columns. How does that happen? Not by office fires. It happens by controlled demolition. The evidence of which is seen that we've seen today. And the results of this study, hey, let's see if we can make this go. There we go. The results of which on the left in the UAF study versus the right from NIST's are completely unrealistic, as we've described, and it even stops 2 seconds into the overall collapse. They won't even show us how it tips over in their own model. They can't get their own model to even look remotely like the actual video in the center. So this is a real problem for them. And what about, if this were a controlled demolition, wouldn't some people know about it in advance? Well, how about this guy? An anonymous structural engineer is asked by the fire chief, Hayden, if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and how soon? Well, he says in its current state, you have about 5 hours. Wait a minute. No tall frame building had ever collapsed due to fire before, and this bozo structural engineer is saying you have about 5 hours, which is exactly when it collapsed. So talk about foreknowledge. This prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge. They will not release the name of this engineer, of course. How about these mysterious construction workers who were walking away from Building 7 in the late afternoon, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down? How do they know? Well, they were told, like others, that the building had structural damage, but it was vulnerable, that the structure was bowing out. But if the structure was bowing out on the damaged side, the building would have collapsed to that side. And NIST even says 7 years later that there was no significant cause of collapse from that damage. Well, here's Kevin McPadden, whom we heard talking about these explosions. Well, he's held back, as we mentioned before, 6 blocks away with others, and he's listening to this radio that I mentioned, held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. Well, here's what he hears after he heard those explosions.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Since when? And what about the BBC's announcement here? Take a look.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. The building's standing, and yet they have the reason for its collapse 20 minutes before it happened. Well, better than that. CNN announces the collapse of this building at 10:45 or 11:07 that morning.
In New York, Alan Dobbs-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke.
Wait a minute. 50 stories went down before 11:07 a.m. at 10:45. If this building had gone down at that time, we wouldn't have any video of it. It would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud, which filled lower Manhattan when the Twin Towers fell. So many people suggest that it was theorized that it was supposed to go down at that time, that it failed to go down, that those mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, announcing its collapse, were there to fix a dud of a controlled demolition. It failed to go off at the time. Well, that's speculation, but it's very interesting and important for future research too. Well, let's listen to Larry Silverstein in this interview in 2002, talking about his reaction to the collapse of Building 7.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
What? They made the decision to pull? Firefighters is what he's talking about here. He says, I was talking about the firefighters. Pull it. That meant the firefighters. Well, the firefighters weren't in the building fighting the fire. And they don't make decisions to pull buildings, a term used in the construction industry, the controlled demolition industry, to pull a building, bring it down. Firefighters made the decision fairly early on not to attempt to fight the fires, due in part to the damage from World Trade Center 7. No manual firefighting operations were taken. So how could they be pulled if they were never in there fighting the fire? He's talking about something else. He's talking about the building, obviously. Well, we could argue about that, but the evidence itself, the hypothesis of controlled demolition, is the one that 3,000 architects and engineers are demanding a new investigation about. So what do you think? This is laid on your shoulders now that you've seen the evidence. We believe we've shown the first 10 key characteristic and very uncharacteristic as well features of controlled demolition, direct evidence of destruction with explosives, none of which fire creates, let alone all of these 10 features. Additional circumstantial corroborative evidence and testimony that we've looked at. We believe this is proof of controlled demolition. What do you believe? Let us know. Andy's going to give you some guidance here, and so we can get to the bottom of this, and maybe you have some questions too. Andy.
Absolutely. So please right now submit any questions that you might have in the same input form we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. And you just click continuing education and select the live webinars, and we will certainly do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved. If now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and it warrants a new investigation.
Thanks, Andy. And while you're there, subscribe to our newsletter, which comes out once, twice, or 3 times a month, giving you the latest evidence that we've put together, the latest efforts, success in our efforts to get a real investigation, and gives you an opportunity to work with us and give us ideas and get informed on the website. We have an incredible evidence section with many more technical articles and bulletins. And this is not difficult information, as you've seen. Anybody can share this information. Anybody can understand that it's important. 3,000 architects and engineers have signed the petition. There's 20,000 others supporting them. So you can be among those if you're not an architect or engineer. And if you want to, we ask you to donate to the effort. We're making strides all across the country in getting to conferences of structural engineering and architects. We're sending out information. We're sending out 400 packets of the Leroy Hulsey report from the University of Alaska on Building 7 to engineers all over the country. So this takes funding, and we're not funded by, obviously, corporations or the government. This is thousands of people like you giving $5, $10 as members of AE 9/11 Truth. Join the family of sustaining supporters. It's really important that we have you with us. And if you can't do that for some reason, then there's so many ways that you can volunteer. Isn't that true, Andy?
That's right. If you've got a few hours a week, this is how you can spend them. And I just heard the other day someone was talking about with everything going on in the world, they feel so helpless. Well, this is a way you don't feel helpless. It's by actively participating, fighting back in a peaceful way and in a way that really has a lot of bang for its buck. So if you've got some kind of talent, and there's certainly many talents that we can use in this important fight. If you got time on your hands and you can spend a few hours either gathering data, making some phone calls, doing some translation work if you're bilingual, or if you got computer skills, there's a number of ways that you can help. But the first step is to go to ae911truth.org. You fill out a very short form, and then within the week we'll get back in touch with you and see where you'll best fit, and you can join the team. And I really, this is how I started back, in 2010. And I'm still with it because it's such important work. And we have so many people who have that kind of story. I want that to be you out there. So please consider it.
Thank you. And there's things you can do on your own too. Contact your elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everybody, screen the DVDs one-on-one or in groups and share them. And the brochures, you can buy 100 for $10 and share them with people. Use us, the technical and building professionals who are laying our necks on the line. You don't have to be the one to take all the heat. Use us. That's what we're here for. And so you take send the PDF of the finite element modeling to your local structural engineers and architects. Wake them up. Show them what is this effort was all about and how it's completely disproved the NIST theory that this building came down by fires. The RFC that we have submitted to NIST, they are due a response within about a week from now. And we've challenged them on the side plates that they've omitted, the reality of that would have trapped the girder from also traveling off of its seat on column 79, the thermal expansion of these beams, which couldn't have happened the way NIST said, the web stiffeners, which they conveniently completely ignored from their analysis, the cascade of floor failures, which they claim but couldn't prove, and which the Hulsey report completely disproves, the global collapse analysis, which could never have happened. The seismogram data completely disproving that these explosion events were the result of a cascading floor failure inside the building before it came down. The eyewitnesses and audio evidence of explosions that have occurred, and the eroded steel that was found, thank you very much, by John Gross, all of which we're going to Congress with. And this is why we want you involved. How do they get involved directly in this project, Andy?
Absolutely. Well, there's a number of ways. We'll first talk about getting involved. If you want to do interaction with your member of Congress, there's no time limits. It's always a good time, especially now since they're taking phone meetings during this COVID thing that's happening. So to do that, you simply find out who your member of Congress is. And if you need some advice first, you can just contact us at Congress at 911truth.org. We've actually got an article in our news history that tells you exactly what to write if you need guidance there. But you request a meeting over the phone with yourself and members of AE 911 Truth. Let us know that you did it so we can keep track of it. We'll let a few weeks go by, and if they don't respond to you, we'll get involved more directly. But they got to hear from you first because you're the constituent. And if we're out of their district, then they may not pay attention to us as much closely. But if you make that first step, then we can help represent you. So when we do talk to them, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the request for correction that Richard's going to talk about. And we're going to talk about the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. Now, this act is named after Bobby McIlvaine. He was 26 years old, and he died in the North Tower on that morning. And what it would do is it would create a select committee in either house of Congress that would do exactly what we've been asking Congress to do for years, look into the evidence of explosions, controlled demolition at the World Trade Center. But as I say every week, Congress doesn't do anything unless they hear from you. So your first step is to get involved, and you do that by going to ae911truth.org/justice. And there's a number of tools on there for being able to do that outreach so that you can get their attention. So please get behind this.
Yes, get behind it. And there's so many ways to put a dent in the side of the wall of denial. We've been doing it for 13 years, but we've only done it successfully when we have large numbers of volunteers and donors. So that's you. And this is what enabled us to submit a petition to the grand jury with 60 elements of our evidence, much of which we've presented to you this week, the rest of it next week and the week after, to the U.S. attorney, who's now agreed in writing to comply with the requirement to give this to a special grand jury. So we've sued him now. Jeffrey Berman is not in anymore. He's been replaced. We hope to have better results and response from his replacement. We've also sued the FBI, who was required to give our evidence to Congress because it came after the 9/11 Commission report. And in the 2015 9/11 Commission review, they were required to give all the evidence that they have, including this presentation, which they had, and the nanothermite paper, which we went over today. So we're working our way through the court system to get success there. And you should be aware that there's now a city, a town at least, in New York area, who all 5 of the commissioners have voted for a new investigation into 9/11, specifically the evidence at World Trade Center. So that's a result of our hard work as well. So we're working closely with them. And he says, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. So he's busy making that happen. Christopher Gioia, fire commissioner, fully supports a comprehensive federal grand jury investigation and prosecution of every crime related to the attacks of September 11th. And he was in part inspired by our landmark documentary, which collects 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence that is an extraordinary body here of evidence. And I want to give you just a taste of this documentary so that you can be sure to see it soon if you haven't already.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We could speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need
the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can watch this movie for free on YouTube, the 1-hour version of it. I recommend you check out the 1.5-hour version in our store, though, because it has an extraordinary sequence of the psychological ramifications of 9/11 and why it's so hard to get people to even look at this evidence and how to do that better, i.e., how to succeed in getting people to look at and comprehend the evidence. Also, the store version has the extended interviews of our experts, which are quite extraordinary. We couldn't fit everything into this 1.5-hour video. But also the 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation, an extraordinary read. You can download it for free at beyondmisinformation.org. You can also get the coffee table professional version of this in our store. And the 2-hour Blueprint for Truth is available free on YouTube, as well as as is the documentary on Building 7, the 15-minute documentary narrated by actor Ed Asner. So all that's available to you. But do we have questions today? I think we do, don't we, Andy?
Yeah, we have 2 questions that came in. The first one asks, NIST was asked if they looked for explosives. They said yes, they had considered explosives, but didn't find any evidence for explosives. Later, when asked to elaborate, they said, well, we listened for sounds on videos and we didn't hear any explosions. Shyam Sunder also said Building 7 fell too symmetrically, which according to him was also very good evidence that no explosives were used. Any comments?
Yeah. Shyam Sunder says that Building 7 fell too symmetrically. Let's just think about this, guys. And I haven't seen that quote from him. Would you send me that quote? I think this is just classic. Which according to him was also good evidence that no explosives were used. Well, it's exactly evidence that explosives were used. He's saying, well, if one explosive was put next to column 79, you would have heard this loud blast, 130 decibels. Probably that's true. But thermite is not as loud, A, and B, we're not talking about one explosive taking out one column. You're going to have many very small explosives, thousands of them, taking out thousands of column to beam connections. Remember, their own computer animation reveals inadvertently that there were thousands of, or hundreds, 400, we calculated actually, structural steel connections failing every second in order for that building to fall as it did. And you can see the releasing of those columns and beams in their computer model. It's completely ludicrous. It's like taking a hose and taking down a sandcastle with a hose. Structural steel frames do not behave like that. And we have 100 structural engineers attesting to that on our website. Later, when asked to elaborate, NIST says they listened for sounds on videos and they didn't hear any explosions. Well, I encourage you to look at 911speakout.org, which is a technical look into the sounds of explosions that were heard. So you'll see very important evidence there. So, and you heard witnesses of explosions, and NIST says they claim that they interviewed all these witnesses. Well, they apparently didn't interview the 6 that we had time to put into this video, and we couldn't make it longer, or you'd be turning the video off by now. So yeah, there's lots and lots and lots of evidence. Andy, you have anything to add to that?
No, I have nothing. I think you covered that. The next one says, in a NIST video called Why Building 7 Fell, the narrator says what we see collapsing is just the exterior shell of the building. But in the NIST animation, which is also in their video, the NIST animation model shows more than 65% of the core is still intact and still supporting the west penthouse when their roofline pixels start falling. Is this what Shyam Sunder meant when he said the NIST model matches quite well with the video, where most of, excuse me, lost my place. Oh, most of the core was still intact and not even close to being just a shell? Isn't this a blatant contradiction?
Yeah, I've got to encourage this viewer to collect some of these incredible questions. Yes, it's a blatant contradiction. In the computer model, we see the left half of the building released, all the individual columns and buildings, like almost all of a sudden, but floor by floor certainly, released. And so when they're released, they fall. They have no connection whatsoever to the columns and beams they were attached to. None of them. And on the right side, which is the east side of the building, they didn't model that, so it remains completely stiff. And they acknowledge this in their report. And yet they somehow claim that this instability travels from west to east, even though they can't even show that, or choose not to, in their computer model. What we've proven by the videos is that the west penthouse and screen wall, which is directly over the top of all the core columns, falls a half a second earlier than the overall collapse, indicating that the core columns were all taken out first, at once, not later, several seconds later, and not in a progressive manner from west to east. So NIST is hanging by a thread here. And that's because structural engineers en masse have not seen fit to even read this 1,000-page report or try to understand the obscurity that has been purposefully threaded through it. And it came out 7 years later, after everybody who did know about Building 7, which was hardly anybody at all, had forgot about it or didn't care about it anymore. Because we were at war in Afghanistan, going to get those bastards who did this to us. So, or Iraq. The lies we have swallowed knowingly have to produce a lot more indigestion than the lies we choose to ignore. Andy, any more questions?
No, that's the last one today.
Okay. Well, here's what we're going to do. That's what we did this week. Building 7 in this 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Coming up next Thursday, 1 p.m. Pacific. Part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. We'll be looking at these incredible explosions and witnesses of explosions. The sudden near free-fall collapse of these towers also. The high-velocity lateral ejections hurling 4-ton structural steel sections laterally at 80 miles an hour, landing 600 feet away, destroying the buildings around them. The shattering of the structural steel frame down to its individual structural components. The mid-air pulverization of concrete, all of which is incredible evidence for the explosive destruction. And then next week after that, part 3, Twin Towers in Extreme Heat, where we look at the incendiary evidence, the extreme heat, which we only touched on today. Molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. So be sure to stay with us and catch these on the archive if you've missed them. Until then, we will we'll thank Andy and thank all of you for listening, and we'll catch up with you next week.